Welcome everybody. You have joined the Sustainable Procurement webinar. How what you buy can change people's lives. Settle in, we've got lots of people joining the call. Looking forward to this session. And this session is a collaboration between CIPS and QUT, because QUT are hosting their Sustainability Week from the 23rd to the 27th of August. So excellent timing. Welcome to everybody. We will get started shortly. And use this opportunity to have a chat using the chat function. If you select all panelists and attendees, and perhaps tell us what country you're joining us from. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. Where are you today? Welcome everybody. This is the Sustainable Procurement webinar, how what you buy can change people's lives. And today's webinar is a collaboration between CIPS and QUT, as QUT hosts Sustainability Week this week. I would like to advise everyone that the webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available to all attendees the following week. Please, as you're already doing, use the chat function and tell us where you're from, tell us what country you're from and what you hope to be getting out of today's webinar. Tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou katoa to our New Zealand neighbours. And I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional custodians of the land on which I present from today. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders today. We have over 200 people registered today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from today's panel. I'm the General Manager for Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Island at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or better known as CIPS. We're your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals. And I'm really excited about today's topic, sustainable procurement, how what you buy can change people's lives. The main motivation for me taking up the role as GM of CIPS in our region was because of that social and environmental role that our professionals play through procurement and supply management. So the impact and the reach is wide-ranging and varied, and I believe that procurement and supply is one of the best professions to be in right now. As the professional body, we're on a mission. We're on a mission to set the professional standards for procurement and supply and to bring to you procurement and supply topics and networks. And today is a fine example of how we're facilitating knowledge and networks, and there's plenty more ways to get involved. So I encourage you to find us on LinkedIn and look out for our newsletters. And throughout the webinar, please use the chat function to all panelists and all attendees and keep the conversation going through the next hour. But if you have any specific questions you may have addressed by our panelists, then please use the Q&A box and we'll attend to your questions at the end. Now, I'm delighted to welcome our host for today's webinar, Chair of the Queensland CIPS branch, Tivolee Spragg. In addition to the immense work she does as a volunteer for CIPS, Tivolee is also the Associate Director of Strategic Procurement at QUT. Welcome, Tivolee, and over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks to CIPS for all their help with the webinar today. I'm really excited to facilitate this session as part of QUT's Sustainability Week. Our Vice-Chancellor recently published an article about sustainability. And I really like what she said. She said, sustainability isn't a buzzword. It means acting thoughtfully and responsibly, always considering the impact of our decisions on others, other people, other species, and also the future generations. QUT has a sustainability action plan that is aiming not only to meet, but to significantly exceed the reduction targets in the Paris Agreement. We are aiming to have net zero carbon emissions by 2030. Our priorities and targets are outlined in the action plan, which you can get a copy online. And it sets out 13 areas for consideration, from carbon, energy, waste and water, to transport, education and research, and also a passion of mine, procurement. We know that through QUT's $350 million annual addressable spend, we can make a significant difference to the world around us through our purchasing and procurement decisions. We've only just started our journey, and I'm really looking forward to hearing and learning from our expert panelists about where they're at and what they're doing to embed sustainability into procurement and purchasing. On the panel, we have three passionate professionals, Sarah, Scott, and Hayley. Sarah is the head of procurement for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC. Sarah is passionate about social and sustainable procurement and was a member of the Standards Australia Committee for the development and adoption of the new ISO Sustainable Procurement Standard. Scott is the founder and director of a Queensland-based group of specialist consultants helping some of Australia's biggest infrastructure projects and organisations be more sustainable, cut carbon emissions, and be more resilient. Our third panellist is Hayley. Hayley is the Social Procurement Manager at Winc. Hayley heads up the Social Procurement team, which covers Indigenous procurement and ethical sourcing, including sustainability. I'll now hand over to Sarah to start the discussions.
Great, thanks for that, Tiv. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Collins, and I start by saying that, as Sharon knows, I like to champion that all procurement professionals say that procurement found them. They didn't fall into procurement. That's my byline. It's going to go on my grave, I think. Nothing to do with today's seminar, but I thought I'd put that one in there. It's an awesome profession we're in. And my journey in this whole sustainability piece really, I guess it started in my career where I'd worked for commercial organisations and I'd done a lot of procurement activities that contributed to their bottom line. But I was starting to have that feeling of I wanted to do procurement with purpose, and I didn't quite know what I meant by that. And I was really lucky. It was back in 2014, and I was the Chief Procurement Officer at the New South Wales Government Roads and Maritime Services, which is the road agency, and it was part of Transport for New South Wales. And I'd formerly, before that, I'd actually been Associate Director of Procurement at the University of Sydney. And sort of through my journey there, moving into that public sector space, realising that we're spending a lot of money that can do a lot of public good, I was really wanting to feel how I could do that, how I could, as well as spending public money in an appropriate way, how it was really giving back. And I was lucky at the time, the then General Manager of CIPS, Chris Gallagher, tapped me on the shoulder because Standards Australia were pulling together this mirror committee, to partake in the development of the new ISO standard, Sustainable Procurement. And CIPS had been asked to nominate one of their practitioners. At the time, I was also the chair of the New South Wales Committee, just for context. Anyway, I joined this group, and it had representatives of all sorts of different industry groups in there. One of them, by example, is on this call at the moment, Marla Bullen, who is at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. And there was a couple of other people. Tanya Harris was another one who was one of the practitioners on it. She was representing the Fred Hollows Foundation, and Tanya Lawler, who was representing Sustainable Choice, which is now part of local government procurement. So there were a few procurement practitioners in this bigger group of about 15, 18 of us. And we started having these very regular meetings where we were talking about the different elements of a standard. And I don't think I really understood how hard it was to do something like this at a global level, because we would work out our position in Australia, and then someone would go back every 6 months to attend a global meeting where all of the different countries had to try and negotiate a position. So, by example, we're trying to negotiate our position on human rights in a standard with contingents from China, by example. So trying to reach that global position of understanding. And that was a very long process. But in 2017, the standard, so it's standard 2400, Sustainable Procurement, was published, which was very exciting for us to now have this in place. And once it was published, we were starting to find, we being the committee in Australia, as we were going out and promoting it, people were saying to us, I don't know where to start. It was a guidance standard. It wasn't one that you would get assessed against, but they're going, I don't know where to start. So on our own back, a group of us was probably about, forget the exact number, maybe about 8 of us who were a subcommittee of our Standards Australia group, who got together to design a handbook, which was a handbook basically to help people build the business case for sustainable procurement. And for people who aren't aware of the ISO standard, I apologise, I'm going to have to read this off my screen, but it has 7 major areas that you focus on. One is organisational governance, the environment, human rights, labour practices, community involvement and development, fair operating practices, and consumer issues. So it's a really, really broad definition or group of things there, because sustainable procurement, according to the ISO standard, has been defined as procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts possible over the entire life cycle. So it's more than just the environmental side. There's sustainability is about things being there in the future. So that's about the suppliers you work with, the communities they're in, the jobs that people have, etc. It's not just about the environmental side of it. So people were finding it challenging to work out how to implement this standard. So we developed this guidebook in Australia, which was really about just giving people the resources and ways to write their business case. And it was something that we got a lot of credit for. I'm going to post links to this, by the way, at the end of my session, but it was a free handbook. And the idea was, we were sort of so passionate behind sustainable procurement. So ISO will probably shoot me for this, but we didn't care whether people bought the ISO standard or not. We just wanted people to start aligning their procurement practices to the standard. So this handbook was available for free, and people could use it to just guide what they were doing around maybe engagement with small businesses. They might want to do it around how they guide themselves on engaging with Indigenous businesses, but it was helping them with the business case. And it was something we were really proud of, and it actually ended up getting adopted by some of the other committees at the global level as well. And we got highly commended in some global sustainability awards as well around this. But I guess I won't rabbit on too much about the guidebook, but what I'm probably trying to say to people is, if you're really passionate about sustainable procurement, it's your umbrella. There's all these different areas beneath it, and you can just focus on one of them. You don't have to go in there and focus on every piece and feel that you need to tick the box on, all of the different complex areas of sustainability. And I know our next speakers are going to talk about some things they've done more specifically. But if you are serious about sustainability, what I did when I started at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is we developed a social and sustainable procurement strategy. And underneath that, we have all those areas I just talked about as being the key areas of the standard. But at the moment, we're biting off the human rights section, which is through our modern slavery statement, and the Indigenous section, which is the community involvement and engagement, which is through our reconciliation action plan. And they're the 2 areas we're focusing on, because we realise that the broader piece is a big program. But once you start getting some runs on the board, you start getting buy-in from your organisations. It helps that there's legislation behind it that helps drive the buy-in as well. That's when then you can start looking at, well, let's broaden that definition of sustainability. How do we bring sustainability benefits into our organisations in different ways? And for me, it's trying to have that umbrella approach. It's not trying to have each of these programs as separate things that, you struggle to get them up in your organisation and get people to buy into them. I'm lucky where I work at the moment that it's not a hard sell. Anyone who knows the ABC knows that we're out there with an audience that's across all of Australia, and we want to represent everybody and make sure everybody can access us. So we do deal with a lot of local and small businesses. People are very passionate about the diversity and inclusion side of things, both with our own staff, but also how we engage with businesses that bring that diversity and inclusion and create jobs, etc. So it's something I've been really rewarded by, sort of moving into the area I work in. But even where I worked previously when I was at Transport, we started developing procedures around, or strategies around, when they were doing large construction projects, bringing in a lot of sustainable targets into them. So they were things around whilst you've got things like your Indigenous participation, it's bringing in things like social enterprises, it's bringing in jobs for long-term unemployed, it's jobs for engaging with small businesses, potentially engaging with people who are older and are looking at retraining, getting women into non-traditional roles. One of the things I was quite proud of actually when I was working at Transport is that there was a whole piece around the women in non-traditional roles, that a lot of the big head contractors were just getting women to come on site as traffic controllers, and that was meeting their targets. And Transport actually put a stop to that and said, no, that they don't contribute to your targets anymore. If you are going to do work with us, you now have a target against you of women in non-traditional roles, but we expect them to be coming in as your engineers, your site managers, things like that. You don't just do a tokenistic person who's a traffic controller. And I was quite proud of getting that step change of people's thinking that it wasn't just a tick box. And I guess I'll probably just sort of summarise now that this has been a very long journey for me now, back to 2014, representing CIPS in this space. And I still have my hat on trying to champion the ISO standard. But to me, it's just procurement. I had someone, Michelle Robinson, who was formerly of the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and she's now seconded across to iCare. She said something really good recently at a forum I was in. Sustainable procurement just should be good practice procurement, because we are creating economic advantage for who we award our business to. So why would we not be making sure that economic advantage was a sustainable outcome in everything we do? And I'll sort of leave you with that. As I said, I'll post a couple of links in the chat, but happy to answer any questions sort of via this function, or people want to contact me via LinkedIn. And I'll hand over to Scott next, who'll now talk about what he's been doing in this space.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'll share my screen to run through my slides. Is everybody, I hope that's visible. Terrific. Thank you very much to everybody for the opportunity to meet with you today in this fashion. It's a great roll-up, and I'm very pleased to be speaking about this topic. I'll be following on from Sarah and taking more of an environmental perspective, which is my background, environment and sustainability, and running through some of my experiences there for your interest. The start of this is around discussing the sustainability in sustainable procurement. And this bit of text you can see in front of you is an outtake from the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And you can see that it's fairly dense reading. It's beautiful science if you love this kind of thing, but it is involved. And this is the sort of thing that suggests that environmental considerations can be a bit challenging to take them into procurement. But it's also recent and important to think about these climate change implications. And a few of the things that I took away from this report, reading it through last week, were that the IPCC is saying that low likelihood outcomes cannot be ruled out. And that includes things such as there's medium confidence that there will not be an abrupt collapse of a significant ocean current before 2100. And I really don't find that very comforting. This will very likely cause abrupt shifts, such as the weakening of the African and Asian monsoons and drying out in Europe. Another quick takeout from the IPCC report is that compared to the 1850 to 1900 range, we will see an increase in the global surface temperature somewhere between 2.1 and 5.7 degrees Celsius by 2100, depending on the scenario. The last time global surface temperature was at or above 2.5 degrees beyond that 1850 to 1900 levels was 3 million years ago. My granddaughter, Beatrix, is going to be 81 in 2100. So this is quite within a foreseeable future, and she'll experience a climate that hasn't been experienced by humans ever. So the very obvious takeaways from the climate change analysis is that, first of all, we have to look at drastically and rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to move on resilience, because there will be elements of the change that will not be able to be avoided. So what can institutions do about this? Well, governments and private sector organizations have a range of tools in their toolkit to respond. Some of them are a bit different. Government probably has more latitude, but they share the opportunity to use their purchasing power to influence positive outcomes. So looking at a conventional model of sustainability of these intersecting spheres of environment, society, and economy, the triple bottom line, what we want to see is these things are represented in the procurement decisions. What happens sometimes is that it becomes a bit skewed. I know in some jurisdictions and with some purchasers, there is an emphasis on things such as labor practices, for example, that might overwhelm the potential to consider some of the environmental matters. And it may be that environmental matters are a little bit difficult to take into account for those that are not necessarily comfortable with them. Just touching on some of my past experiences with Brisbane City Council in the early 2000s, we had an opportunity where we were able to change the market for diesel in Queensland, where the Brisbane City Council, which operated a bus fleet, requested a tender for 620 some odd million liters of diesel that were ultra low sulfur diesel, which was not at the time available on the market. Having succeeded with that contract, BP then changed their refinery and sold only ultra low sulfur diesel throughout the state. It also had an experience with council where we went through the process of acquiring the next lot of buses, about 120, 180 buses, with a couple stages of multi-criteria analysis and then a value for money index, looking at a variety of environmental, commercial, technical, and other considerations. So it took out of the equation the fuel type that the bus was to use, because it was very much focused on diesel fuel buses, and ended up with the decision that we would have natural gas buses, which are quieter and had a number of other benefits at the time. An unsuccessful attempt at using social procurement at the time was to look at buying renewable electricity for council and encourage the creation of a renewable energy plant as the outcome of that long-term investment, like a 20-year PPA was proposed, power purchase agreement. Unsuccessful at the time, but maybe successful these days. And I know that the City Metro approach has been successful in putting together a solar farm to back up the operation of Sydney trains. So as I mentioned, environmental expertise can be difficult to get a hold of and apply, but it is needed to discern amongst options. There is an option to rely on some proxy expertise that is built into things like environmental labels. Now, those also require some critical thinking. You might have had an opportunity to look at the Netflix documentary, Seaspiracy, which actually looked into the dolphin safe and MSC type labels and raised a number of concerns, which I acknowledge are contested, but nonetheless, dolphin bycatch is still occurring. There are conflicts of interest on the way these relabeling systems are rolled out. It's impossible to monitor remote ocean operations, and fisheries in the main remain unsustainable despite the voluntary label schemes. Another case in Australia of interest to us, because we undertake auditing of infrastructure projects for sustainability. So auditing is part of the services that we provide. And what occurred in Perth with other auditors is that it turned out that the Mint was buying gold from a murderer who used child labor and mercury. Not a good look. The auditor, over a period of 7 years, had failed to identify any non-compliances. And the standard that was being applied only had supply chain audits requiring desktop studies of major suppliers using publicly available data. And the auditor made no additional independent checks. So that caused some difficulties with that certification. Another among several opportunities to factor in environmental information is environmental product declarations, which are becoming increasingly popular. They are independently verified and registered, providing transparent and comparable data over the whole life cycle of environmental impacts for a product. What it doesn't tell you, though, if the product is good or not, it just discloses that information in a reliable way. So, for example, you could have a semi-automatic weapon that actually has a EPD on it. Now, there are also systems that encourage better practice in the application of these standards. iSeal is one of those, and the infrastructure sustainability system that we work with is aligned with iSeal, although not fully compliant with membership on that. And there is also an international standard for environmental claims made voluntarily by companies for products. One of the funny things that I think about that international standard is that it actually prohibits you claiming that a product is sustainable. So moving into the construction field where we do a lot of work, and I noticed that Sarah has a background in this as well. is that procurement is multi-layered in construction. I'll talk about three elements of that. First of all, strategic procurement to transform markets. The Inland Rail program provides a good example of this, where at a program-wide level for all the many projects it encompasses between Melbourne and Brisbane, it's looking for some strategic procurement for things such as railway sleepers that allow that organization to promote sustainability. And they've done some excellent work in sustainable procurement. An example that is yet to be realized is in relation to using biodiesel for construction in Southeast Queensland on road development for the Department of Transport and main roads. They have attempted this on a project-by-project basis, but there isn't enough demand in that manner to be able to have it brought to market. So there's a potential, say, for the department to say, this is what our expectation is across the region of Southeast Queensland, and perhaps that could lead to the creation of a biodiesel plant in Brisbane. The other two elements are the procurement of entire projects and the procurement during project delivery. So first of all, in terms of entire projects, in the buildings area, there are some whole project standards around Green Star you may be familiar with, and for more or less existing buildings, the neighbor standards in place. Infrastructure, where we primarily work, there is the infrastructure sustainability rating scheme and a variety of tools under that. For infrastructure projects, it's critical to consider the whole of life. These projects go through multiple stages, long years of operation, and then potentially deconstruction. So the timeframes could be 50 to 100 years or more at times. So whole of life thinking is an essential element of sustainable procurement in this way. That means looking at the upfront capital costs as well as the operating costs. And procurement in this sense is best considered as part of a phase of total asset management, and considering things such as future-proofing, resilience, we mentioned climate change before, and refurbishing. Within the IS rating scheme, there are many credits, and the credits are designed to promote sustainable practices across many topic areas. There are actually 3 credits that address sustainable procurement. SPR1 is Sustainable Procurement Strategy, SPR2 around Supplier Assessment and Selection, and SPR3 is Contract and Supplier Management. So the first credit is looking at identifying risks and opportunities in supply chain, having a commitment and strategy in place, reviewing progress, and having proactive communication. The second credit here is having requirements for sustainability in the specifications, making selection of suppliers in ways that include consideration of sustainability, providing feedback to suppliers, successful and unsuccessful, having rewards built in for stretch targets, and proactive engagement for more sustainable solutions. In the contract delivery supplier management side of things, the requirements then have to go into the contracts. The compliance with those contracts needs to be monitored, non-compliance actively managed, and then looking to reward that superior performance that may eventuate, and actively supporting sustainability improvements. Some of our learnings from these years of experience in this area is including avoiding absolutism. So no matter what is being purchased as a product or service, it has to meet the fit for purpose requirements. Otherwise, it's not sustainable to buy something that doesn't meet the requirements. Applying the principle of materiality means looking at the high priority outcomes in relation to what stakeholders care about and what the impacts are, and not getting tied up in what we call the rats and mice, where you might invest a lot of time for little outcome. It's important to help small businesses sometimes come to terms with sustainability if they're not familiar or comfortable with those type of requirements. And social enterprises offer some great solutions to our markets, but are they suitable for a particular situation, and are they competent to undertake the work to the required standard? Speaking about some of the issues that we see in construction, timing of decision-making for procurement is awkward at times because a lot of procurement activity occurs before the tender has been completed. So those are sort of outside the realm of the certifications, but sometimes deals are done well before a contract is awarded. One of the things I find amazing, I'm sure this audience would be interested in, is that commercial teams can be under-resourced. I don't know why for a project that's spending such huge amounts of money, they would not have enough people to do it properly, but that seems to be what has occurred. And it's hard to approach those teams and talk about things that they may consider peripheral to their core business, such as sustainability, if they're not resourced to do what they have to do. Obviously, construction projects are highly cost sensitive, with the motivation to not lose money on a project. And that's combined with this risk aversion where, something is new or different or requires a bit more thinking time or an adjustment, that is interpreted as an additional cost to that cost sensitivity. We see some inflexible contract models, and one of the things we found is that, for example, the use of geopolymer concrete noise walls in one project wasn't possible to get up because the supplier was not able to do a supply and install contract. They could only provide the supply, and it kind of got eliminated to the process in that way. Innovation is fundamental to sustainability, but it is challenging, particularly in this area where there are fairly conservative and inflexible engineering standards. I mentioned a bit of wishful thinking procurement before, such as with the Department of Transport and Main Roads, where it's hoping for biodiesel, but it's a forward commitment to purchasing might deliver some better outcomes in that area. And because a lot of infrastructure is publicly funded, we have small p and large p political interference at time with the procurement decision-making. So the ideal that we would see is that there is an authentic commitment to sustainable future as a core business principle, that the intent to use procurement to achieve outcomes is understood throughout the organization. The expertise is available, the time is available and applied, and there is a coherent decision-making process. Added to that, we've got patience, nerve, and tenacity, and hopefully we'll have greater sustainable procurement outcomes. So thank you again for that. I'll just exit my presentation. I'll be passing on to Hayley Scott from Winc.
Hello, everyone. Kia ora to my friends in New Zealand. Miss very much, miss all of you. So I am Hayley Scott. I'm the Social Procurement Manager at Winc, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about sustainability at Winc, what we've been working on, and I guess go through some of the process that we've been working through to get us to this social agenda that we are launching in the next couple of months, I think, probably next month. So Winc has undergone a huge transformation over the past 12 months. And as part of that, we recognized that we weren't quite where we wanted to be in terms of sustainability, but we had different areas of the business that were doing some really great stuff. There was just not that cohesiveness that you might see. So I'll just run through top line, what we're working on, and I guess the pillars and how we've kind of connected those to the different areas of the business. And there are a few key points that I want to highlight, but we'll go through those. So am I going to the next slide? Okay, here we go. So safe work practices. So we've linked all of our sustainability actions back to the Sustainable Development Goals. So for those who haven't seen that, I highly recommend that you go and have a look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and just see where you can link your company action back to some of those worldwide goals. So safe work practices is one that we had already been working on. We have been doing a lot in this space, but we really wanted to focus on that as part of our social agenda and I guess increase the spotlight so that the whole business was looking at it, because as part of the cadence of this, we have a monthly catch up with the CEO where we all have to report on where we're at, and that sort of I guess that top-down focus on it is really important because you've got the backing of management, you can take actions, you've got support where you need it to get some of these things across the line, because as we all know, trying to make changes in the business isn't always really successful. So having that support is really important to be able to move that forward. So these are our 2 targets for safe work practices. Gender equality, again, is another one that was already sort of in action, but bringing those ones together as something to report on. So we definitely want to increase the representation of women in senior leadership and management roles. So at the moment, I think we're almost at 50%, but we're really looking to increase that over the next year. First Nations people support. This is something that Winc is so passionate about, and this is one of my favorite things about Winc. So if you ever get a chance to talk to anyone at Winc about Indigenous businesses and the different ways that we support Indigenous businesses, I would highly recommend, because everyone there is really passionate about it. So Winc is a founding member of Supply Nation, which is really exciting for us. And we're just about to launch a joint venture with another Indigenous business, which has 20% of all profits going back to a charitable foundation. Again, so exciting for us. And so we do a lot of work in this space. We're really passionate about it, and we really want to encourage economic development and employment opportunities for Indigenous Australians. So as part of the Pauline E. McLeod Foundation, where we are donating our funds to employment opportunities, economic development, and entrepreneurship, which is so exciting. Ethical sourcing, this is my specific area of expertise. So I'm responsible for this, our modern slavery risks, and all of our ethical sourcing throughout the business. I have one target here, but we have a whole strategy behind that. So this is all about reducing reducing inequalities worldwide. So we use SEDEX as part of our ethical sourcing program, and I would highly recommend using the tools that you have available out there to help you if you aren't sure where to go. I do spend a lot of time in this role working with small businesses, like Scott mentioned before. The kind of that small business support, a lot of them aren't really sure where to go or what happens next. So it's about kind of working with them to get an understanding for the requirements, where they need to go, legislation changes, things like that. Responsible packaging. So this is a huge one, and it kind of goes back to something Sarah was saying before about not focusing on everything. So focus on the areas where you feel you can make the most difference, which is absolutely what we've done with our responsible packaging. So we actually have 4 targets in this area, but I split it up over 2 slides. So with responsible packaging, it's something that has been lacking over the past couple of years at Winc. So we really wanted to focus on how to make our packaging more sustainable, how to reduce our waste, how to make our products more sustainable. So this is probably one of the biggest changes to our business in terms of creating that social agenda. And as you can see from this, it's Winc operations, it's the merchandising team. So it is really a cross-functional collaboration, which is probably one of the most important parts of creating a social agenda or any sort of sustainability goals, is that cross-functional collaboration, cooperation, and getting everyone kind of onto the same page. So then we also have more of our operations team involved, and then our sales team involved quite a lot with assisting our customers to move away from single-use plastics. The state legislation has helped that journey along the way, but we still need to work with our customers to make sure that we are ahead of the game, and it's not it's an easy transition rather than a straight changeover. And climate change is another one that we're focusing on, reducing our carbon emissions from Winc's business activities. So I guess that's kind of an overview of what that is. Yes, that is an overview of what Winc has pulled together for our social agenda in the past couple of months. And yeah, it highlights the cross-cultural, the cross-functional collaboration, the top-down emphasis on it, and also the fact that we were doing a lot of really great stuff, but it's about pulling it together, getting that highlight across the business, which increases the cooperation from different areas of business. So some of these we were doing in isolation, like our single-use plastics removal, is now accelerated because we have that additional support across the business. So that's it from me. If you have any questions, pop it in the chat box. I'm going to hand back to Tivolee to go through the next stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Hayley. And I'll also welcome back Sarah and Scott. So far there's 3 questions in the chat box, so I'll just go through those. So the first one was, how do we balance the acquisition costs of goods and services and the sustainability costs, which sometimes can be conflicting for any business organisation? Hayley, do you want to maybe talk through that? Balancing the cost?
Yeah, so I guess when you go through any sort of procurement process, you have a basket of criteria that you want to hit. So you've got your sustainability and environmental criteria that you need to hit. There's clearly a price, timeline, and then your ethical sourcing and other considerations and relationships and things. So I think it is about getting the balance between that basket of criteria. And it's not, okay, we're going to pay 10 times as much and get the most environmental option. It's about including that in your procurement thinking and in your procurement processes, that it is a consideration as a total basket, if that makes sense.
Thanks, that's great. Another really good question is, how do we communicate the positive social change from these initiatives to the decision makers within organisations? Scott, do you want to maybe talk about?
Sure, I can provide some comments. Thanks. So in terms of communicating the positive social change, there's during the decision process, and I suppose after the experience of the purchase, during the decision process, being able to lay out the kind of analysis that Hayley spoke about to support a proposed decision that is rational, well argued, and backed by evidence, I think is useful for leading to the right kind of decision, and also positioning the proposal so that you're not adopting I guess you could say a radical environmental position for the sake of it, but having a considered view. Reframing some of the cost issues in terms of, say, the whole of life rather than just the upfront cost, and getting a complete perspective. And on the after the fact side, I touched on in my talk about these, I guess you could say, the benefits realization element of sustainable procurement. So being able to monitor what the impact is and collecting a series of learnings we went down this path. We had these experiences and we had long-term benefits where we were able to save money or avoid problems down the track. And that builds a collective support from decision to decision around the usefulness of a sustainable procurement approach.
Thanks, Scott. And I think, as Sarah mentioned earlier, it is about getting those runs on the board. So, don't underestimate the opportunities in doing some simple things. So, for example, here at QUT, we've moved to DocuSign for all our procurement sign-offs. That saved a significant amount and is a really visible way of showing people the benefits that some of this can do. And that's not just from an environmental perspective, but from a probity, transparency, and also speed as well. So Sarah, I've got a question specifically for yourself. So somebody said thank you. As you rightly mentioned, sustainability shouldn't just be a tick the box. How is ABC making sure that it's included in evaluation criteria, and what weighting should be applied to it so that it's not just a tick mark? And then it just goes to say, then it says, for example, choosing local providers can be tricky in some categories such as ICT.
Look, I'll probably broaden that question a little bit, because I remember back when I worked at the University of Sydney, and I left there in 2013, so I'm talking 8 years ago, we were already bringing sustainability in. Now, I do have to admit, it was more the environmental side. I hadn't had the epiphany yet of the bigger definition. It was more the environmental, but I distinctly remember having a conversation with someone who was saying, you know, it was only about a 5% weighting, and it was saying it's not going to make a difference. Why are we asking it? I remember said, because we need to get people to start thinking. And I sort of liken the sustainability journey a little bit to safety. One here who's got a construction background will know, if you go onto a construction site, the very first thing every morning is a safety briefing. Would that have been happening 10 or 15 years ago? Probably not. People would have known safety was important, but were they doing that? Was it their number one focus? My team always laugh, and I do have one of my team on this call, Kylie. I start every one of my meetings with a safety moment, or it's now a safety and welfare check because of our lockdown, but because it doesn't matter. You don't have to just be in something like a construction environment. So we've changed that perception and acceptance of safety. So why can't we do the same with sustainability? So starting to ask those questions, you know, way back, it's getting people thinking. And it doesn't necessarily be the make or break, but maybe it can be the differentiator between two organisations. And also sort of thinking, well, not making assumptions about whether a supplier can respond in your category, because you don't know unless you ask. By example, in the Indigenous space, I get really frustrated when people just think Indigenous suppliers do things that are more consumable based or labour based. There are Indigenous suppliers registered on Supply Nation in every category you can possibly imagine. There's lawyers, professional services, construction companies, all sorts of things. Don't ever make assumptions about what suppliers potentially can do. And we currently ask a lot of questions in the diversity and inclusion space, where we ask some questions about Indigenous participation, other things around D&I, sustainability initiatives, etc. And we do assess them on that. But to this date, one of the best responses I've ever seen from a sustainability perspective, and it was environmental context, back when I worked at the University of Sydney, was from one of the big 4 consulting companies. Now, would you have thought that an office-based organisation like that would have such a big sustainability initiative and program behind them? Most people would probably be quite dismissive and say, we're going out for professional services, we're not going to include this stuff in there. As I said, don't make assumptions. You'll be really surprised what comes out. You might not be able to select a supplier themselves that is a small business or Indigenous, etc., but you might select a supplier that has fantastic programs in that space about how they are giving back to the local communities or creating sustainable outcomes. Or there was a question I saw in the chat box about concerns around using cobalt and stuff like that and modern slavery in their supply chains. You'd be amazed what programs companies have in the background, and you should be assessing all suppliers on those sort of things. Very long-winded, sorry, but it's something that I think people have too narrow a view on.
Thanks, Sarah. I've got a question for you, Scott. How do you envisage an organisation buying construction contractor services to start on a sustainability journey?
Well, I guess if I understand the gist of the question properly, the sustainable procurement element is part of the overall business strategy. So as I was saying, the ideal is that an organization has a commitment to sustainability that's a core commitment. And that's expressed through, say, a policy on sustainability, through the kind of reporting that we've talked about from an annual basis. So that core exists. And then the move towards sustainable procurement is a recognition that that's one of the mechanisms that the organization can use to move down a path of greater sustainability. And I think what we experience in these sort of changes with organizations is making the most of the existing processes and systems that are already in place. So there are likely to be arrangements for weighing up decisions, for example, commencing procurement exercises, and then perhaps tweaking those sorts of things to expand the considerations that are already being made. And that sort of provides the additional confidence that you have an established process that's being augmented, rather than here's something completely new you've never heard of, and it's about time you started doing something about climate change.
Thanks, Scott. There's been quite a few questions about modern slavery. So that's a future webinar that we might look at running. I'm happy to share my email address, and also we can connect with Hayley because QUT has published a modern slavery statement, and I'm more than happy to share the work that we've done in that space, and I can connect you with other people as well. So I think one of the next questions for all three of you is where did you each start your journey, and how do you tackle the feeling that it is so overwhelming? There's so much to be done. Hayley, do you want to maybe kick off?
Yeah. So start small. I actually had someone tell me the other day, a post-it note for every thought, right? So it sounds ridiculous, but if you start by mapping out exactly what you want to do, and it can be like really basic categories, like I want to do something in the ethical sourcing space, I would like to do something in the sustainability and environmental space, and and kind of map everything out and then prioritize exactly where to start. So you don't have to do everything all at once, but start by doing something, anything, and it builds from there. And I guess that's pretty much my advice. Just start small, try something, and then you can build on it in the future.
Thanks, Hayley. And I think that came out of Sarah's talk earlier as well. It is big, but really start small. Look at putting it all under the umbrella, which both Sarah, Scott, and Hayley have talked through. There's been quite a few questions about cost. And a lot of people saying, well, going sustainable means paying more. And how do we value the benefits of it if you have to pay more, the total cost of ownership? Does somebody want to touch on, does being sustainable mean paying more?
I can touch on that. Without going into any specifics, I'm aware of a few case studies in my past lives and current lives where people haven't even realised they've made a choice that had a sustainable outcome. So it could be they didn't realise it was an Indigenous supplier they were engaging with, or they didn't realise it was a small business, and then won the work outright without having to have anyone sort of give extra consideration to weightings or anything like that. So I guess what I'm getting at there is it doesn't always cost more. And you'd be really surprised if you start looking into your supply chain. You'll probably actually be really surprised some of the organisations you're already dealing with who have got there on their own rights without anyone needing to give them extra weighting or preferences, etc. That said, I do appreciate that some of the suppliers, especially when they are smaller and they've got the overheads and startups, etc., does get harder for them. So sometimes the way you can help there is it can be about the length of the contracts you can give them, or it can be about extension options of contracts. Because if they're trying to put a competitive offer to you, but they need to invest in equipment or something like that, they need to be able to go to their financiers and get backing, etc. So, instead of looking at a 2-year term, if you can look at a 2 + 1 + 1 or things like that, that sort of stuff will help them, which will also flow on into what they're able to offer you. Some organisations will provide weighting to sort of say that, if you are in these particular categories, you get additional weighting in your outcome. There's also in the government space policies around the procurement thresholds, and if you're going with, say, Indigenous or a social enterprise or a small business, what the thresholds are in that space as well. So there are also ways there that the suppliers can get a foot in the door. And I think it's also important to give them feedback and give them an understanding of why they're not getting your work, because that's something they'll very much learn from, in terms of, was it because they don't know how to respond to, say, a government tender, which can be very overwhelming? Is it that their costs are just completely out of the water because of the nature of what they're doing? You need to give them that sort of feedback because they can't learn from it either.
Thanks, Sarah. Just leading on from that, one of the questions is, how do suppliers shine to buyers, whether it's government, private sector, as it relates to sustainable procurement? So if a supplier is doing something really well in that space, how do they communicate that to buyers? Hayley, do you want to maybe kick that off from your experience?
Yeah, I can say a couple of words. I think really just so I find a lot of sustainability professionals are really passionate about what they do, and they're so willing to talk about it, as you can see by everyone on this call. So really, I guess, engaging with that and showing your passion. Don't be afraid to show that this is something that you are genuinely passionate about, because I do think that people really respond to that. And also putting that at the forefront of your presentation, or however you're engaging with potential buyers, is really highlighting those sustainability aspects up front. Because while it would be great for everyone to have sustainability questions and considerations built into a procurement process, just so that we're thinking about it every time we're making a procurement decision, not everyone has that. So it's about presenting that up front and being really kind of, not necessarily in your face, but being really passionate about the value that you can deliver from a sustainability point of view.
thanks, Hayley, for that. So I might just give a summary from the presenters, which I thought was fantastic. So there are lots of questions on there. Hopefully we've answered the themes behind those. But I think really the takeaways that I've got from today is really focus on one area and do it well. This is big, so start small. Look at developing a strategy that encompasses the different pillars or the different levers underneath. Really focus on what are the benefits to your specific organisation. Make sure it's not just a tick the box exercise. I think that came across loud and clear. Linking to the UN goals is something that can really help organisations break this down into small targets and small goals. I think, and Hayley mentioned it quite a few times, you know, that cross-functional collaboration is key. So as procurement professionals, we can't do this all by ourselves. It's really key to collaborate. Work with businesses, work with our suppliers to see what's out there, really help, especially smaller businesses, you know, to develop. So I'd really like to thank our three panelists. I think hopefully people got a lot out of it and a lot to take away. I do encourage each of you, as we close off the webinar, there will be a little webinar survey. So please encourage each of you to take the time to complete that survey. And really thank you everybody for taking an hour out of their day to listen to us. Please make sure that if you have any more questions for myself or any of the panelists, you can reach out to us on LinkedIn or through CIPS directly. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you have. As you can see, all four of us and CIPS itself are really passionate about this topic. And as Sarah said, this is not just about sustainable procurement. This is really just standard procurement. And how do we make this part of our day-to-day activities? So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.